Hey, White Sox fans, it's Brett Ballantini here hosting the South Side Sox podcast. We got something different and a real treat for you. We're not talking to one of our usual writers and going on about spring training or whatever. We're talking to Erin Santana, who's the minor league education coordinator for the Chicago White Sox. And you've probably read a little bit about her, maybe through MLB or some athletic pieces, but thankfully, through sort of an interesting coincidence, what we may get to later on in the podcast, was able to get in touch with Erin and ask if she wanted to participate in a little bit of South Side Sox intro, background, education. So we're going to launch right into it. Thanks, first of all, Erin, for hopping on. This is a really terrific thrill for us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
I guess, first of all, let's just talk a little bit about you. How did you grow up as a fan in the game or just as a sports fan in general before even having this become something you do as a profession?
Yeah, so my family are huge baseball fans. So my dad's family is from Vermont, and my grandfather played college baseball at the University of Vermont. He was a left-handed pitcher back in the 40s. And actually, when he married my grandmother, their honeymoon was to go to, I think they went to spring training for the St. Louis Cardinals because one of his former teammates was pitching for them. And he got to pitch batting practice on his honeymoon.
Wow.
So
and your grandmother knew what she was getting into if she was going to spring training
yes,
for her honeymoon.
I know, right? And then on my other side of the family, my mom is actually from Mexico. And so my grandfather is a doctor. He's 97 now. Yeah, and he was a huge baseball fan, and his residency was in Boston. So he became a Red Sox fan very, very soon after moving to Boston. And so I've always said I grew up with baseball from both sides. And for my Mexican side of the family, that was one of the only places growing up here in Maine that we ever heard Spanish. And it was really, it felt like a safe place for us, and felt like we could be accepted. Kind of, we saw other people like us, which in Maine was very rare.
So aside from having to be prepared to maybe potentially one day change your socks, at what point did you go from fan to thinking, hey, maybe this is something that I could actually do, as my livelihood?
Well, my mom always tells the story that when I was little, I talked about being an agent for Latino players, like since I was little. And I obviously did not end up following that path. But I was in education for years, and one day was thinking like maybe it's time to explore what's out there, and happened to see a job opening with MLB actually in the commissioner's office, because I've worked in recruiting of underrepresented populations as well. And it was actually an HR job with the commissioner's office. And I thought, oh, I could go for that. And I went to apply for it and it was gone. So I was all upset. But I didn't let it stop me. I went on LinkedIn and just kind of figured out who would have been hiring for that. And lucky for me, it was Tyrone Brooks, who runs MLB's diversity pipeline program. And I reached out to him and said, if you ever have other positions, let me know. He took a look at my resume and was like, you've done education for years. Like, teams need educators right now. And so that was about 3.5 years ago that happened. And it just worked out that my resume got passed along to a bunch of people and ended up in Chris Getz's hands.
So were the White Sox really the first team you had some kind of advanced talks with? Obviously, it helps that they have an opening and an interest, and they did. But was it sort of a first, sort of good luck first shot with the White Sox?
Yes, it actually was. The Mets reached out to me maybe even a couple of weeks after I was talking to the White Sox. But I was very honest with them. It was like, I'm kind of pretty far down the road with the White Sox, so I think I'm going to stick with them. And I'm just so happy with how it worked out. I mean, I couldn't ask for a better situation.
How important and encouraging was it that Chris, who I believe sort of took a little bit of what the model was with Kansas City and wanted to incorporate that with the White Sox, how important was it to have a guy you're talking with and who maybe is ultimately hiring you to be to sort of know what it is, to have an idea of what it is you want to do rather than just being handed the keys and say, all right, go figure it out?
Yeah, that was amazing. He actually got my resume because Jeff Diskin, who works for the Royals, saw my resume
Okay.
first. And Jeff said, I know Chris is looking for someone just like you. I'm going to hand it over to him. And it's just been awesome to have that support. I mean, Chris has seen how successful Kansas City
Right.
program has been and has given me the freedom to be able to kind of implement a lot of things from Kansas City, but also come up with my own ideas. And he's just been super supportive.
What was I suppose you weren't exactly building from completely from ground up, but what was the circumstances you're down there, maybe in the Dominican facilities or just in general, knowing that you had to build, but did you really have much foundation to build with? And was that a good or a bad thing, being able to sort of cultivate it and create it yourself?
Yeah. So we had some things in place. We had a company that we were contracting with down in DR that provides English language learning. And then we had a teacher who was an hourly employee, basically, in Arizona. And that was about it. And so when I came in, the first year, Chris was like, take stock of what we're doing, figure out if it works for you, if there are changes you would make. If there are little changes in this first year, go for it. Otherwise, like, just start planning for this first year. And so by the second year, I was able to get a full-time teacher in DR who only teaches for us and a teacher's assistant. And so we were able to really, really launch our high school completion program down there with the teacher's assistant. And then I have a teacher in Arizona as well, who's a full-time employee. So about, I would say, like 25 to 35% of his job is actually teaching class, but he's also kind of a baseball ops type of guy too. So we've been really lucky to have that.
Were there other organizations, either to begin with or even ongoing, that you sort of, I imagine it's a bit of a somewhat limited fraternity that you sort of bounce ideas off of or borrow ideas, from as this evolves?
Yeah. So when I started, there were, I want to say 13 teams that had someone in my position total. Definitely the pioneers are Mayu Fielding from the Pirates, Sharon, I can't remember her last name, but she works for the Tigers, and then Jeff Diskin from the Royals. And then even the Dodgers have been doing some stuff for about like 10 years. And so we were able to, they have been great about sharing materials and kind of sharing successes and challenges. But then I would say even in my first year, teams, MLB kind of highly suggested that teams hire someone in this position. And so now I think we're up to 28 maybe out of 30 clubs. And so we have been really lucky to kind of grow together. I have a group of, there are 5 of us total that kind of work for similar organizations. So one from Cleveland, one from Minnesota, one from the Marlins, and one from the Phillies. And the 5 of us girls are on WhatsApp constantly. Are you having trouble with this program? Are your guys struggling with this? We're not sharing trade secrets, but we're, supporting each other. And I have to say that group of 5 women really, I couldn't do my job without them. Just because there's so many little intricacies to navigate when it comes to educational systems of other countries.
Yeah.
And so we kind of do it together.
And we're going to get into maybe the nuts and bolts a little bit of the program here in a second, but a little more big picture. When we've talked to Luis Robert last year, he made it pretty clear that, and I'm sure there was a little bit more involved in this, but the Cardinals were coming after him heavily, and the White Sox seemed to be the two teams that were really involved. And the thing that he told us was, knowing the heritage the White Sox had, particularly with Cuban players, but if it was a tie, he knew some of the White Sox players and personnel, but if there had been a tie, he was familiar with what you'd consider like a tradition at this point with the White Sox. And of course, all teams have it to whatever degree. And you play an increasing role in that. Maybe even just a minor role, but it's a significant role. And when you hear things like that, and when you know that there's beginning to be this, this so-called pipeline or whatever, but that there's attractiveness about the White Sox, how personally rewarding is that to you to know that this is one of many tangible ways that your work is paying off?
Absolutely. I mean, that's huge. It's really, really nice to hear that guys are feeling comfortable, that they're being able to, not have to worry so much about the off the field stuff. Because I mean, that's really what my purpose is to make sure that the challenge is just to be good on the field, and the challenge is to work as hard as you can. And then when you're off the field, you're not struggling to figure out what to order at a restaurant. You're not struggling to navigate issues with a landlord, for example. And Luis Robert is obviously a very special case. He flew through the system, had like 4 different teachers. Every month I was hiring a new teacher. And he just rolled with it. And so he definitely, took advantage of his time in the minor leagues to soak up as much as he could. And I know that culture of, I want to pass it down to the next guy who's like the next me, is paying off. I mean, I see it with Yoelqui Cespedes. I literally teach him 4 to 5 days a week, just one-on-one, me and him, because he wants it, because he realizes from his teammates how important it is.
How, the instruction and actually the nuts and bolts of what you do, that's probably your thing. We don't really want to dig into that too much, but I guess, and you do have obviously one-on-one, you probably have maybe more of a group setting at sometimes, but probably a lot of it is, and the most valuable stuff is the intensive one-on-one. How much of that is sacred, or how much is encouraged? I'm just curious, maybe as a personal philosophy, whether it's watching maybe subtitle programming, whether it's even English slang, how sacred is what your text is versus just be a sponge and try to get it all, because that can maybe introduce problems for you with your instruction.
Yeah, I mean, our whole program is designed for baseball players. So we are trying to confront whatever situations they might come across. And so if it means like, watching something on Netflix with the subtitles on will help them to kind of pick up what their teammates are talking about, or, just to feel more comfortable with their teammates, then great. But all of our instruction is, I mean, it's geared towards people who play on, like they play baseball. Sure. That's their thing. Their thing is not sitting around reading books. So we're not really doing that. We do a lot of role plays, a lot of like fun games and things to try to make it fun. So
it's like me. I download the Spanish English baseball dictionary because that's cultivated to what I need. Sure, the dictionary is very important, but yeah, I can see how you want to be able to get some stuff first, and then maybe you can get to the other things.
Absolutely, and that's huge. And one of the things too that I'll just mention is that our teachers are on the field. Our teachers are, if there's a game going on and there are pitchers sitting, our teachers are sitting with them. We take English is part of everything, and make sure that it's relevant to them, or else they're not going to buy in.
And from what I've been able to sort of track about the program, that obviously it's gaining acceptance, it's gaining popularity to the point where maybe there's even a little bit of peer pressure to say, hey, get more into this, and of course, when guys, Yomer Sanchez and probably even Luis at this point have, ascended, you can look back and say, hey, there's some real value in this. So do it. But you're probably going to run into players maybe who are maybe a little more reticent or, just unsure, or they might even be sort of, maybe even at times faking to go along. Like, yes, I understand when maybe they're not really throwing down the NTND. So is that, is a challenge for you? It's obviously not just as easy as, okay, it's time for class and there's never any hitches or problems.
Yeah, no. um, I mean, I've literally knocked down one of their doors. One of them had a test and he was in his room sleeping, and I was like, somebody take me over to his apartment. I'm banging on the door because this kid is not going to miss this test. I mean, yes, that absolutely happens. But there is that growing culture among the players, and guys are seeing the most successful players are the ones who are really taking this seriously. And I'll give Luis Robert credit. He has always said, people talk about 5 tools on the field, but I see English as one of my tools. And if I'm not good at it, I can't understand what's happening, and I can't be the best player that I possibly could.
And let me tell you how impressive it is when, again, even last year in the Zooms, speaking to Luis came up a ton, of course, right from the jump, and to see him following along to the English questions, of course, relying on the Spanish translation from Billy, just for, of course, his comfort, but to know enough to the point where even for some quick answers, for him to just shout it out in Spanish. I know he did that in English. I know he did that to me a couple of times. Granted, it was probably a jokey question, but he caught it, and he just jumped at it as a way of beginning to transition into perhaps one day fully answering in Spanish, and seeing that sort of stuff's got to be incredibly encouraging to you.
Absolutely, yeah. He's very smart too, so that helps.
No kidding. And then I guess in speaking again a little bit to the reticence, I think you and I, briefly exchanged some ideas before we did this, and I spoke about how me and Alice way back, a decade ago, Alice Ramirez had discussions about sort of training each other, him for English, me for Spanish, sort of that agreement. But then when it came time to do a lot of the interviews, oftentimes he would call the interpreter, over, which is understandable, of course. Jose Abreu's a guy I see following along every time. He's always nodding, so it's pretty clear he's understanding pretty much all of the English, and yet still feels comfortable only responding in Spanish. Is that something you feel you need to push guys past, or is it really just a personal thing where it's like, hey, you got to do what you're comfortable with?
Yeah, I mean, I never got to work with him, obviously. So, but that's one of the things that we do, even starting in the academy. We have them start to do even just basics. Our teacher records them as if he's a reporter. He actually used to be a radio person. He's got a great voice for it, and he really acts like a reporter. And just to get them used to having someone in their face, like asking questions, because it is a comfort level for a lot of them. I mean, and I think about our American guys. There are American guys that are scared to do interviews too in their native language. So then trying to imagine producing in a second language, obviously it's very difficult. So yeah, it's something we're working on, and trying to make it as realistic a setting as possible too.
Unfortunately, sometimes when you hear some of those English for native English speaking interviews, you say, gosh, I wish they would have maybe been a little bit more careful. We might get to that a little bit in the second half of our podcast. Before we take a little break, it's such a fun anecdote. I think I read it in James's athletic story, but just take me sort of through the thrill and the surprise of seeing Arvin Mendoza give his first, at a very young age, give his first English interview, maybe up at Great Falls, but the thrill that must have been for you.
Yeah, I mean, that I will not lie, I started crying. He sent it to me. I actually didn't find it. And when he sent it to me, I was like, oh my gosh, what did he do? Because I wasn't sure if he was ready. And I mean, I just watched and was like, oh my, like this is a kid that I had in DR, and really one of the first kids that I got to work with at a pretty young age. And so just to see the growth in him was amazing and just so rewarding. And yeah, he has grown a lot in so many ways, and just such a good kid. And I was so proud of him. So.
On that note, we've reached probably around the midpoint of the podcast. We're going to take a real brief break, and we'll be back in just 1 minute. Hey, back here. It's Brett Ballantini on the South Side Sox podcast with Erin Santana, who handles the education, all the coordination education for the non-native speaking players. We've been talking a lot about that. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the responsibility the English speaking personnel and players have. And let's kick that off by just talking about what I think is an aspect of the program you're encouraging, which is perhaps to have players sort of have an English speaking sort of like study buddy, or is that an element you're trying to work in terms of sort of interfacing as soon as possible with teammates who are English speaking?
Yeah, so in the AZL season 2 years ago, obviously, we decided to have a combined English Spanish class. So we had all of the guys that were in Arizona at that time were working together to teach each other. So we basically made little binders that had both English and Spanish, and we would work together on pronunciation and figuring out how to say certain words. And then we also every week they would have one day where it was separate. So our Spanish speaking players could actually, like, some of them were a little more advanced than our English speaking players were in Spanish. So that worked out really, really well. And it was so well received by the guys that were there. We had Michael Kopech was rehabbing and asked to be in the class. So that was really cool for some of those younger guys too, to be like, oh my gosh, this guy wants to be in class. And he was great. So.
Yeah, and it's super encouraging that the culture is such that, maybe even as little as 5 or 10 years ago, you've got native English speaking players who are maybe just assuming the work has to all be done on the other end, and they have to come to me, they have to speak my language, they have to understand me, they're an American, all that type of thinking. And I imagine just in your short time with the White Sox, you've seen the beginnings of that, that culture change, with which I guess Michael Kopech is maybe, the latest big exclamation point to that.
Yeah, it definitely has. I mean, I think I have the advantage of every year a new group comes in. They don't know what we did last year, so I can say this is what we do here, and everyone has been really receptive and accepting of it. The other thing too is that Chris led that trip to Dominican Republic a few years ago, where he took some of the American players down, and that really changed a lot of guys. Having to feel what it feels like to not understand anything that's happening around them really gave them a perspective that they could kind of take back to the clubhouse and be like, I'm going to help my buddy here because I know what that feels like and it's not fun.
Yeah. I guess that said, and certainly not pointing fingers at any, one organization, because, baseball and society in general is still struggling with a lot of these types of conflicts and transitions, and making people who aren't like you feel welcome in your workplace or just in your neighborhood. Obviously, maybe about a month or so ago, there was a situation in Seattle where, executive really spoke very frankly, and in a pretty denigrating manner toward at least one player who sort of made this transition and successful transition to become a bilingual baseball player, to the point where he's actually, sort of a media figure. When you hear those stories, is it mostly discouraging? Is it helpful to know, okay, there are still people on the other side, who might be working against me? Is it simply ignorance? Does it just make you more determined?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to what happened out there about anybody else. But yeah, I mean, it definitely makes me feel more determined. I mean, I end up being pretty close with these players just because, I mean, we form a relationship, and I mean, Harvey Mendoza, for example, calls me mom half the time. So it feels personal in that way, just because like I see these guys as my kids, and it feels I wouldn't want anyone to speak like that about any of them. But it does encourage me just to continue, and I will say too, like I said before, I feel super lucky to work for the White Sox because we are an organization that I just feel positivity from the top down. I mean, I'm very supported by everyone I come in contact with. I have not felt any degree of like, why are you doing this?
Right.
Why is this happening? Like, what is your job? Why are you
Right.
here? It's been the exact opposite. It's like, Erin, get on the field. I need help. And I'm like, are you sure you want me on the field? Like
Right.
I also understand, gender dynamics as
Mm.
well. Like I'm a woman showing up in very much a man's world. Um, so yeah, it encourages me more than anything.
Mm. The we're talking here, and it seems peer, I'm using the term peer pressure, but the peer value, whether it maybe even as a native English speaker, but certainly among even players in each class, or players have moved on and maybe are talking to a class as they're more advanced. Along those lines, how important are some of the motivators, like the incentives, the graduation, that type of the ceremonial stuff, to reward players for even maybe a small step along the road.
Absolutely. I mean, we're always trying to reward players in different ways. The graduation really has been the big motivator. We had our first class like 3 years ago now, with Anderson Comas and Luis Mieses, and the two of them just, I mean, people look up to them and
Mhm.
people are like, you guys were our first graduates. And so now, I mean, players come in asking us about the program now, whereas before we had to like do a whole meeting and, be like, this really would be good for you. It's mandatory. Like, I would say it was mandatory. It's not really, but and it's become a huge motivator. So now we do fun little games and things, and we also, this past year before COVID, of course, we're planning to have class captains. And so these are people who, they take ownership of the class. They make sure that guys are being quiet and paying attention. They are the leaders in the class, and they are just, yeah, we want to give them as many leadership opportunities as possible too, because that becomes motivating as well.
Mhm. I've known Billy Russo for quite some time. He's played a lot of different roles in the organization. How important is it, for me, and interfacing with players at really more or less the major league level? How important is it for them once they get there, even if they've pretty well mastered English, let's say, but if they're still in the transition of that, to have a guy that they like, that they can consider a peer, that they can tease and maybe can get teased back, to have that kind of collegial atmosphere, rather to be somebody who maybe they don't know, maybe in some ways they can't relate to.
Yeah. No, I think it's huge. We're really lucky to have a guy like him who can just like you said, like joke around with them, becomes a friend. I mean, I totally get how that happens. They trust him, and trust is so big, especially, I mean, imagine going to another country that you don't know, just to have someone who's done that himself and been able to navigate the systems here. It's having that trust is huge. So yeah, that's a really important aspect.
What given that we still are in the pandemic circumstances, and even seasons are still somewhat in doubt, certainly at the affiliate level, obviously we can see maybe One positive side being that it could allow for more opportunity for more intensive study. I mean, there's just less, there's less distraction you're allowed to. We all should have probably learned 2 or 3 languages during this time off. But are there downsides in terms of maybe some of that practical learning? I know there's been museum trips and such, and I imagine an important part of the language learning is also, it's culture learning, it's assimilating, and that stuff's cut off, and maybe in the near future, maybe for this entire season, it's going to be cut off. Is that a real downside? Not that there's anything positive to come out of a pandemic, but that is an aspect that we might overlook because you think, well, you can just sit there and keep reading and studying, you should have this licked by now. That other stuff is an important aspect to the educational process. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, just the culture piece, being able to navigate different places. I mean, I talk to the guys all the time about accents, for example. Our affiliates are in places where people have accents. Yeah. And I tell them all the time, there are times that I don't understand in Alabama or North Carolina. And so we try to talk, like sometimes they try to imitate the accent a little bit in class, but like being there, there's nothing like being there. There's nothing like actually hearing native speakers with that accent to be able to figure out what they're saying. And then on top of that, yeah, absolutely. The trips that we get to do, I mean, some of those things, it's not just like, here, let's like do some culture learning. It's like, let's do something different. Let's get out. Let's have fun. Let's get to know each other, in a different setting. Let's, I mean, last year, we had apartments during spring training. We had guys learning how to do laundry. I mean, I'm not really on Zoom teaching kids how to do laundry. I've done it, but it's, it's not the same as standing right next to a kid and being like, this is how you do it.
Yeah. Beyond pandemic, it's obviously a huge challenge itself. In the last year, we've had such interesting political transitions. We've had protests, we've had police violence, and even speaking to what you just said, folks who not only are perhaps accented and very difficult to understand, because believe me, I'm right there with you, it is a challenge, but people who might not care. They don't want to necessarily be understood. They don't feel they need to be understood. I imagine you have to call a special session here and there, maybe to address things that have nothing to do with language, but just here's the challenges you're faced. Here's how you should feel good about what you're doing that maybe some of these other people you have to deal with don't care about doing. Sort of giving them that value or making clear the value of what they're doing, which is an extraordinary effort. I mean, millions, maybe billions of people across the world have, but and they're just one of them, but there are a lot of people they're having to deal with who don't care. It's not important to them. And that's got to be sort of daunting and could probably be possibly be discouraging at times.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think you'll find those people anywhere that you go. And yeah, I mean, we definitely talk about that. But it's more, like, let's have conversations about even their own cultures and where they find things like that in their own culture, as well as US culture. But I think it's just something that all the teams are going to have to address in some way. But yeah, it's got to be done.
Yeah. We've lost the Great Falls affiliate. There's one fewer. And of course, Great Falls, like any of the stops, present challenges. I don't think there's a situation probably at this point where there's ever just a sole primary Spanish speaking player on a squad, or if so, that would be very rare. But the fact that there's one less affiliate, which would then mean there might be more peers at any one stop. Do you anticipate that, as much as you don't want to lose an affiliate, you anticipate that perhaps helping the mission or helping the comfort for players, given that they'll feel less alone? Because let's face it, just because guys are from different countries, they could be from the same hometown and they might not get along. So it's not a given that, oh, well, there's another Spanish speaking guy there, so he's fine. That consolidation on many levels is sort of a downer and a negative thing. But in this respect, it could very well help players.
Yeah, it definitely could. I mean, I think guys, it's funny to see guys who make the transition from Dominican Republic to Arizona, because that's where you see it the most. Is in Dominican Republic, there are some differences. There are some times that, a Venezuelan guy will be like, I'm going to stick with my Venezuelan guys, and a Dominican will stick with his Dominican guys. When they get to Arizona, they recognize, oh, I gotta get as many allies as I can. I don't care where you're from. If you speak my language, we're friends. And so a lot of that bonding does happen when they first hit the US. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm definitely bummed to lose Great Falls. We had such a great culture there of homestay families and people that really took care of our guys. And so that is a real bummer. But I think there will be, that opportunity to even bond even further in the affiliates will be really, really important for some of these guys.
What's your sense of, I mean, this is a sort of an offshoot of what we just spoke on. And certainly stateside, we tend to see again politically where we just want to look at Spanish speaking peoples as all one and they're a block, and there's no, just because there might not be that great a difference between Iowa and Illinois, we assume perhaps Ecuador and the Dominican Republic would not have such a big difference, when in fact there probably is a significant difference, and it's a mistake to just paint with too broad a brush. I'm going to ask a question that has to do with that sort of Cuban pipeline. Obviously, that gets a lot of very deserved attention. Last year, the first four players in the batting order were Cuban for the first time for the White Sox, and for the first time in baseball history. That's stuff to be very proud of with the White Sox. I don't suspect that there would be resentment among players who come from other countries, but is there a danger in getting a little too caught up in just focusing on, one great success the White Sox have had, when really they are trying to recruit and cultivate the best talent from anywhere in Latin America?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously differences between all of the different countries and the cultures of those countries, but I haven't seen a whole lot of division between guys. I mean, we're like, when one of them moves up, we're like all cheering. It feels like a family, like that we're all kind of there cheering them on. And I think, I think I haven't noticed much like resentment or anything like that. And I feel like we've got great examples. We've got Eloy, and he's been a great example for our Dominican guys, and just both as a person and a player. And so I think that's helped. We've got some diversity.
Yeah, and with the commonality of the language challenge, the culture challenge, and the sort of all for one for all that you spoke of earlier, that's got to override anything where it's like, oh, hey, he's got a different flag, than me, because there does have to be some unification just to get through it together.
Yeah. I mean, it really is a bonding experience. I mean, these guys they spend more time with each other than they do with their families. And so, if you think about a guy from another country who enters the academy in January and never gets home until almost, if they do instructs, they get home maybe in October. And so they're spending almost 10 months away from their families. And so they're brothers. These are brothers. These are, best friends and feel like family.
I, spoke on the culture shift, and I think there's more, if not pressure, there's more incentive for native English speaking media and really even fans to have a vested interest in the well-being, the connection, the understanding, across cultures. I've spoken very briefly to you about, the things I've tried to do, or the challenges that are out there. Aside from watching, say, music like a movie like Sugar, what are the sort of things that we as native English speakers, who might not even have any Spanish knowledge at all, what are the sorts of things you'd encourage us to do, or even just attitudes to adopt, just maybe be better understanding of what these players are going through, the plight they've undergone?
Yeah. I mean, I think to a small degree, most people in this country have felt at some point in their lives like a minority, or felt, different in a situation that they've been in. And so then multiply that by 10, I think it's important just for people to be empathetic. I mean, these guys, we're closing the gap in terms of how much extra they're doing compared to their American teammates, because the Americans are really coming in too. They're coming towards them and trying to learn Spanish and trying to work with them, and so we're trying to close that gap a little bit, but our guys do so much more work. Like, you think of a typical AZL day, the American guys might show up at, I don't know, 2:30. The international guys are showing up at 11:30 because they've got class, and then on top of that, if they haven't finished high school, they've got at least an hour of high school work to do before they even step on the field, before they even step in the clubhouse. They are doing hours of extra work. And so, they're away from their families, and they don't know the language, and there's just so many things that contribute. And so I think it's important for folks to think about, just imagine yourself as an immigrant to any other country where you don't speak the language. But then on top of that, imagine that your job also depends on that.
Yeah.
This is their livelihood, and we have to remember that.
Yeah. And speaking of incentive to keep guys engaged, maybe even with their own high school studies, much less just learning the language, underscores how important a position like yours is, because a big part of what you're doing is being someone they want to work with, but giving them the incentive to say, okay, if you get through this lesson, here's where you go next, and eventually, maybe you're done, or you've achieved, or you've graduated, and it's easy to overlook, I suppose, but that's a big deal to be able to to keep the carrots out there to say, okay, come on, you're almost there, and look where you're going to get to next.
Yeah, and I mean, you never want to think about them not playing anymore, but that's also a thing that we have to talk about, is that you're not all going to make it to the major leagues. You're not all going to have a ton of money at the end of this. And so what is something that we can do to ensure that at least you will have a comfortable lifestyle afterwards? One of the kids who graduated this year was released, and he he's in the US and has a job in the US. But then he lost his job recently and said to me, now I can say I'm a high school graduate. That's going to help me get jobs. And he was like, I never thought of this before because I was playing and I didn't think it would.
Yeah, it's just a task to do, not something that actually can function for you as sooner than he thought, I'm sure. But all right, let's circle it back to you, Erin. Aside from, I guess, possibly having to change your socks and become a White Sox gal, how has being in this position and working with these guys, how has it changed how you absorb the game, how you watch the game, how you enjoy the game?
Yeah, it's changed a lot. I mean, just having this personal connection with people now it's better than I ever thought. Honestly, I mean, I've always watched baseball. I mean, you could find me as a 9-year-old girl watching Red Sox games literally every single night. And now to be able to watch the games and really know what it took for someone to get where they are is so exciting to me, and also rewarding. And just like every day I pinch myself, like, am I really in this position? Do I really get to, like, work with these guys and hopefully make their lives better in some way, but also like then get to see them achieve greatness? Like, I never could have dreamed of this when I was little. Never.
I think you found, from listening to you, and I think you have found the sweet spot of a pretty awesome job if you're just like, oh my God, I'm pinching myself each day to do this work. And so everybody listening or watching, don't be too jealous, but
I know, right?
She is in the spot. This has been extremely eye-opening and so much fun to do. And definitely, Erin, I hope we're able to talk again and do a lot more work with you together, because this is an important story that I think is easy to overlook. And if we're only paying attention to the Luis Roberts when they're superstars or when they're all-stars or MVPs like Jose Abreu, we're missing a big part of the story. I think it's very important, and listen, it's sort of fun. Of course, there's some drawbacks, and guys get released and such. It's not all home runs and grand slams, but there's just so much that's rich in this and what you're doing and what you're leading for the White Sox. So I, as a fan, certainly appreciate what it is you're doing, and certainly hope we can do a lot more together in the future.
Absolutely. I may be hitting you up to do practice interviews with with some of my players.
Now that would be fun. All right. Well, thanks everybody for listening, watching, reading. Always South Side Sox, and certainly special thanks to the White Sox for making Erin available to us, and of course, Erin, for giving us being so generous with your time here today. And I hope we can do something again real soon together.
Definitely, and thank you for profiling my players. I love seeing when I get to see them and see their names, and I usually forward them on even if they can't. So
there are definitely more to come. We're only at 50, so there are definitely more to come, Erin.
Can't wait.